everyone. I am Natasha de Souza, and I lead our Taste and Consumer Experience division for a group of companies. And my colleague Mar and I are very excited to be spending some time with you today to talk about bitterness sensitivities. So let me start our talk by telling you a little story. So I grew up in the southwestern part of India in a state called Goa. And as a young adult, while growing up in Goa, I got a chance to visit a local brewery as part of a college field trip tour. And at the end of that brewery tour, the brewery had set up a tasting station where they were showcasing many of the beers that they were producing. And while I was tasting those beers, I found that some of them were way too bitter for me. And I looked around and I noticed that, several of my colleagues were having the same reaction as me. There were a few that were actually enjoying them. And so that made me realize at that minute that perhaps there are different sensitivities to different foods, and particularly with regards to bitterness. So how many of you have had such a similar experience? If you think about when you've tasted different types of beer, if you found them some bitter than others, or maybe even in coffee. There are different types of coffee, and you may have noticed that you are particularly sensitive to one or the other. Or in chocolate. For example, you might know that you like dark chocolate versus milk chocolate, and some taste bitter to you versus others. And it doesn't stop there, right? In fact, we are surrounded by bitter tasting foods. If you think about everyday foods that you've had in your daily life, for example, a protein beverage, or an orange, or a grapefruit, or even in places where you might not have expected sweetness or bitterness. For example, in sweeteners, some sweeteners might taste bitter to you. And so that is because even though they are very different tasting compounds, they all elicit the same basic bitter taste. So it means there must be several different mechanisms for triggering the same signal in our brain, which is bitter. So why is that? Why do we get those same reactions? And why do that perception varies greatly amongst all of us? So I'll tell you today that bitterness is entirely, your ability to taste different levels of bitterness is entirely genetically dependent. And it's particularly related to this one gene called the TAS2R38. So again, remember I mentioned that your ability to taste this compound that was on this paper is particularly genetically dependent on whether you have that receptor or that gene, the TSR238. So first, let me tell you. So why this different? But let me tell you about what was on that paper. So that little strip of paper was coated with a compound called phenylthiocarbamide. I know it's a lot of words, but for today we're going to call it PTC. So why PTC, right? You wonder why PTC. Well, first let's go to a basic tasting review of how tasting happens and how the brain gets our signals. So if you look at the picture on the left of this slide, we know that our tongue has tiny bumps. You probably felt that on your tongue. And each of those bumps has little taste buds that look like the picture there. They're kind of deep into your tongue. And those taste buds are filled with gustatory cells, or the cells that do the actual tasting. Okay? So when the inside of those cells, if you take a closer look under a microscope, you'll know that the taste buds, or those gustatory cells, are lined with several kinds of receptors. Today we're going to talk about bitter taste receptors. But whenever a compound, whatever that is, bitter taste compounds, attaches itself to one of those receptors, your brain, or there is a reaction happening which stimulates a signal that is carried by the nerve to your brain and tells you that you've tasted something bitter. Okay, so back to why PTC. Why did most of you taste what you tasted bitter and some of you didn't? There were about probably 10% of you that didn't taste anything. So way back in 2003, genetic scientists discovered a particular gene on chromosome 7 that helped explain why humans vary in their perception to PTC. So there are several known forms of this gene, but there are two most common forms. One is the tasting form, which we will call for today the capital T. And then the other most common form is the non-tasting form, which we will call the small t. So if you go back to 8th grade class and if you remember what you learned in genetics, you know that each of us gets 2 copies of the genes. One we get from our mom or dad and one from each parent. So if both your parents gave you the dominant gene or the tasting gene, you are a supertaster. Okay? If both your parents gave you the non-tasting version, you are a non-taster, so you didn't taste anything. And if you got one variation from each of your parents, then you might have tasted something but not as intense. And the difference between the non-tasting and the tasting gene is they code, so every gene codes to a protein, so they code for a slightly different shape of the receptor protein. And the shape determines whether PTC is going to bind to that receptor or not, or how tightly that connection is. Make sense? So for this very reason, it's a fun fact. We're going to have trivia at the end of the conference today. So fun fact, so because of this reason, it is linked to hereditary. PTC testing was actually used in paternity determination back before even DNA testing was a thing. So this slide may be familiar to some of you, or to maybe most of you. This is our little taste receptor cell, and there are numerous taste receptors in there. The 5 basic tastes, we know them as sweet, salty, umami, sour, and then bitter, which we're talking a lot about today. And what I want you to look at this slide is you will notice that most of the basic tastes, in fact all of them, except for bitter, have 1 or 2 taste receptors. But bitter is a family of taste receptors. In fact, in humans, there are 25, as of date, 25 known taste receptors, making bitter the most complex of all the basic tastes. And each of those taste receptors can bind to a specific bitter compound or to several bitter compounds. But it does pose the question of when you are trying to work with bitter tasting foods or mask bitterness or suppress bitterness, which compound are you working with and what taste receptor are you going to work against? So think about that. So your tongue has anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 taste buds. So there's a lot happening on your tongue. And those taste buds are not distributed in the same way for all of us. In fact, each of us has a very unique pattern in how those taste buds are distributed on our tongue. So you not only have different amounts of taste buds, but also how they are mapped on your tongue. So your tongue print is as unique as your fingerprint. So we've talked a lot about bitter sensitivity, but the next question you might ask me is, okay, how does my ability to taste different levels of bitterness impact my daily life, right? So back when, in 2003, scientists discovered that PTC sensitivity was different, there was a lot of research done in 2004, 2005, and the years that followed to understand the relationship between your PTC sensitivity and your lifestyle choice or your body mass index or your food, your diet choice. There are 2 papers I'm going to talk about today, but one of those papers suggests that people who are highly sensitive to PTC also find alcohol or red wine or whiskey, certain whiskeys, to be more bitter. And so therefore, they consume less alcohol, they might have a lower body mass index. A similar study was done on the relationship between PTC sensitivity and cigarette smoking. And they found that if people were very sensitive to PTC, they were also more likely to be sensitive to the bitterness in cigarette smoke and therefore less likely to be smokers. So you might ask me, okay, how does bitterness also change with age? Bitterness sensitivity. And bitterness sensitivity is one of the two basic taste sensitivities that decreases with age. The other one is salt. So sweetness and sourness do not decrease as you age, but your ability to taste bitter and salt do decrease as you age. So you probably have observed older men and women less likely to taste bitter and develop a liking for bitter foods as they age, and they also seek more salt in their diets. So again, this slide here, what do you see in this slide? Lots of green, lots of vegetables. Okay, so what's common in some of these vegetables? We have like cilantro, we have peppers, we have broccoli, bok choy. Many of them are actually bitter tasting vegetables, right? So I see some of you nodding your heads. But in this case, you would not want these vegetables or foods to taste anything other than bitter. You would want them. There is a certain level of bitterness that is expected in some foods, right? So think about sharp cheeses, think about your coffee, or think about some types of chocolate. You might not want all of that bitterness to be masked or suppressed. In fact, you expect some sort of bitterness, or at least it shouldn't be objectionable, but it should still taste like the food it's tasting. The other thing to note is also that most foods and beverages today are not made of a single ingredient. There are a lot of things happening in that system, right? If you think of a food matrix or a beverage matrix, for example, even your coffee, there's dairy, there's caffeine, there's coffee beans, maybe a sweetener system. And in sensory, we tend to call that interaction of different tastes as mixture suppression. So in the case of your coffee, your sugar that you might add to your coffee or the sweetener might interact with how bitter the caffeine tastes for you. Or in an energy drink, for example, the caffeine might enhance the sourness. So there's a lot of things going on, which what I want you to take away is it is important for us to understand what matrix we are working with and what ingredients and how that develops the final taste. So another fun fact is that sweet and bitter are the only two basic tastes developed as birth. So if you think of infants, if you think of or little babies, if you have them, or of yourself as a child, if you give an infant any type of food, there are two emotions. Sweet, if you give them sugar, they will right away know that they like it, versus a disgust for bitter. And again, I don't know if you already know this, but there's a lot of research right now being done on taste buds throughout your body in other places than on your tongue. And one of the key is a gut. So gut is being researched as a place where taste buds reside. So we've talked about bitterness. You know today maybe a little bit about yourself, a little bit more aware of how you are as a taster. But how does that perception of bitterness vary throughout the globe? Today we work in a global environment. We don't work with maybe just one country of products. We're catering to a global environment. And so globally, it is known that on an average, there are about 70% of the world's population is a super taster. So about 30% it does not taste bitter. And how that breaks down across the regions is North America has about 25 to 30% non-tasters, whereas Latin America, we are here today, 90% of you are super tasters, and that's exactly what we saw in the room, that very few of you raised your hands, so that's absolutely correct. We know that in our company as well. When we did this, we found the exact same results. And the same is true for Asia and Africa. We have more super tasters in those regions, but But on the other extreme is Australia, where there's only 50%, so it's 50-50, 50% non-tasters. So how might you consider all of these facts when you are developing for your global markets, right? And as I think of myself in that brewery, trying to understand why people had those different reactions, I now know that, of course, most importantly, your genetics and your culture play an important role. But there is also some expectation of bitter foods, whether bitterness should be present in that food or beverage, or even a learned ability. I have learned myself to have trained myself to like or to at least accept coffee without any cream or sugar. And that was hard, but I had to learn it. That doesn't mean I'm not sensitive to bitter, it's just a learned ability. So think about that when you are developing foods for. Do you know who you are developing for? Do you know what market you're developing for? Do you know who your consumer is? And then do you know how those different ingredients in the food system or beverage system interact with each other? And so here I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mar, who will share with us her life examples of real life stories where she's worked on some of those problems herself.
Pero entrando un poquito más ya al tema de la modulación de sabor, ¿cómo se pueden desarrollar productos que tengan el mejor perfil? Incluso podemos preguntarnos si es el sabor correcto el mejor sabor para tu producto. Tomando en cuenta que dentro que en la actualidad tenemos diferentes herramientas con cuales trabajar para lograr la modulación perfecta, y tomando también en cuenta lo que Natasha nos comentó acerca del sabor amargo, ¿cómo funcionan los bloqueadores de amargo? Recordamos que dentro de la lengua, y ahora sabemos que en otras partes también tenemos papilas gustativas, tenemos estos receptores de sabor en los cuales se unen a compuestos y de ahí pues, se da la sensación ya sea de amargo, sabor dulce o amargo, ácido. En este caso el receptor amargo se une el bloqueador, esta tecnología de bloqueador de amargo se une al receptor, bloqueándolo de manera que no se percibe, que no se une el compuesto, por ejemplo, amargo, como podría ser la cafeína en un café o la teobromina en un chocolate. Entonces, al bloquear este receptor no se está dando la conexión, entonces no se percibe el sabor amargo en este caso. Ahora, ¿cómo podemos hacer uso de esta tecnología? No necesariamente tenemos que bloquear toda la percepción de amargo, simplemente tenemos que saber cuál es la cantidad correcta que quieres en tu producto. Ya sea que tengas, por ejemplo, un chocolate amargo, que no quieras que tenga toda esta sensación de amargor, pero quieres seguir consumiendo por ejemplo, los antioxidantes que tienen. Entonces tienes que definir cuál es la sensación de amargo que requieres, que necesitas para tu producto. Para hacer esto podemos hacer uso de unos simples pasos para desarrollar los productos haciendo uso de los bitter blockers. Quisiera mostrarles esta tabla que fue una evaluación sensorial que hicimos directamente con consumidores de una bebida en la cual era la misma base en las dos muestras, pero en una agregamos la tecnología de amargos. Como pueden ver, el 87% de los evaluadores reconocieron que la muestra menos amarga era la que tenía los bitter blocker, con lo cual estamos comprobando que en realidad funciona esta tecnología y podemos hacer uso de ella en los desarrollos que están teniendo compuestos que pueden aumentar el amargor. Eso sería todo. Muchas gracias.